The wind howled through the skeletal trees of the Manitoba wilderness, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of anyone foolish enough to linger. Elias Crow was no stranger to the cold. He'd grown up in these parts, a trapper's son with calloused hands and a sharp eye. But this winter felt different. The snow fell heavier, the night stretched longer, and the wolves had gone silent. Too silent. It started with the tracks. Elias found them near his cabin one morning, long, clawed impressions in the snow, too big for a bear, too deliberate for a wolf. They circled his home, never crossing the threshold of his salt line, a habit he'd picked up from his Cree grandmother. She'd told him stories of the Wendigo, a spirit of hunger born from desperation, a creature that haunted the forests and preyed on those who'd tasted forbidden flesh. Elias had always laughed off her tales as superstition. But the tracks made his stomach twist. Days passed, and the food dwindled. A blizzard had trapped him, burying his traps under drifts too deep to dig out. The hunger gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. He'd boiled his last strip of jerky into a thin broth, and even that was gone. By the seventh day, his thoughts turned dark. He remembered the deer carcass he'd found a mile out, half frozen, abandoned by some predator. It wasn't fresh, but it was meat. The salt line shimmered faintly in the moonlight as he stepped over it, axe in hand. The forest was still, save for the crunch of his boots. When he reached the carcass, he hesitated. The meat was gray, slick with frost, and stank of rot. But his stomach roared, drowning out the whispers of his grandmother's warnings. He hacked off a chunk and hauled it back, cooking it over a sputtering fire. It tasted like ash and shame, but it filled him. That night, the dreams came. He saw himself running through the trees, faster than any man should, his breath steaming in the air. His hands were claws, his teeth jagged, and a hunger burned in him that no meal could sate. He woke drenched in sweat, his jaw aching as if he'd been grinding his teeth all night. The next morning, the tracks were back, closer this time, pressed right up to the salt line. And there was something new, a low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Elias gripped his axe, his heart hammering. He told himself it was just the wind. But then he saw it, a shadow flitting between the trees, tall and gaunt, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed like embers in the dark. He didn't sleep that night. The wail grew louder, and with it came a voice, rasping and guttural, calling his name. Elias, you've tasted it. You're mine now. His reflection in the cabin's cracked mirror showed sunken cheeks and eyes that glinted too brightly. His fingernails felt sharper, his teeth too big for his mouth. By the third night, the salt line was gone, scattered by the wind. The thing outside didn't wait. It crashed through the door, a towering nightmare of sinew and bone, antlers branching from its skull like a crown of thorns. Its lipless mouth stretched into a grin. You called me, it hissed, its voice echoing inside his skull. You fed me. Elias swung his axe, but it passed through the creature like smoke. Pain erupted in his chest, his limbs twisting as the hunger he'd tried to bury clawed its way out. He fell to his knees, screaming, as his body warped, fingers lengthening, skin splitting, teeth sharpening. The Wendigo watched, unblinking, until Elias's screams became a wail of his own. When the storm finally broke, the cabin stood empty. The only signs of Elias were the tracks leading into the forest, long, clawed, and deliberate. The wolves stayed silent, and the locals whispered of a new shadow in the trees, a hunger that would never be satisfied.